On behalf of the World Affairs Council, I am Terry Kramer, and I'm going to be your moderator this evening. It's my pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker tonight. Kenneth Roth is the Executive Director of Human Rights Watch, one of the world's leading international human rights organizations. Prior to joining Human Rights Watch in 1987, Mr. Roth served as a federal prosecutor in New York and for the Iran-Contra investigation in Washington. A graduate of Yale Law School and Brown University, Mr. Roth has conducted numerous human rights investigations and missions around the world. Let me now ask you to join me in welcoming Kenneth Roth.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be back here at the Council, Terry. Thank you for moderating this evening. When I'm done with my opening remarks, I'd be happy to answer questions about sort of any contemporary issue, whether it's Syria or Egypt or the Central African Republic or drones or NSA surveillance, I mean, you name it. But I've been asked, because today, December 10th, is Human Rights Day, I've been asked to reflect on how the human rights movement has evolved in the 65 years since the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted. And I haven't been around 65 years, but I have been around a bit. So just to a large degree, I actually don't have to look into the history books. I can actually just reminisce. And there have been enormous differences. And I thought it would just be interesting to share how things have changed, some of those dramatic changes. And then we can open it up for broader conversation. Now, first, I think it's worth noting that the human rights movement as we know it today is in many ways both older and younger than the Universal Declaration. It's older in the sense that there were human rights movements long before the Universal Declaration. If you think about the anti-slavery movement or the women's suffrage movement, those are human rights efforts. What distinguished the early human rights movement is that it could only take on big, long-term problems because there were communication issues. How would you know about a massacre on the other side of the world? I mean, it wouldn't get to you until it was way too late to do anything about it. So the only thing you could take on were things that were slow enough moving that you could learn about them, build a movement to address them, and gradually generate pressure for change. And that's why all of the early examples we have of human rights work take on these big, long-term problems. Now, even with the birth of the modern international human rights movement, and many people I think would attribute that to the launching of Amnesty International in 1961. I should say the Human Rights Watch wasn't launched until another 17 years later in 1978. But even in the early days of the human rights movement, things still moved slowly. This was obviously the pre-internet days. It was a moment when it was still very expensive to make phone calls. So people didn't make international phone calls. They wrote letters. And if you talk to the people who were involved, say, in Amnesty's early research efforts, they would literally write a letter. Dear so-and-so, is it true that your uncle has disappeared in Guatemala? Mail it. Wait for it to come back. And slowly you could piece together enough information to put out a report. But it was just a very different pace. I think back to the first investigations that Human Rights Watch conducted, and it's almost embarrassing. We would send a delegation to a capital, and they would interview some people for a week or two, and they would come back and write up a report over the course of, say, the next 6 months and publish it, and it would be big news. Articles in the New York Times all over the place because nobody else was doing this. But it was an incredibly slow pace. Now, needless to say, the world has sped up, but it happened only gradually. I mean, I still remember how revolutionary faxes were. Now, why was that? Well, because you didn't have to waste the money on a lengthy international phone call, which was, prohibitively expensive. You could, put it all down on a piece of paper and fax it in a minute or two, and that was feasible. And suddenly you didn't have to wait for the mail. But of course, what kind of began to move us into the modern era was the internet. And even there, though, the first real internet campaign that Human Rights Watch was involved in was the one around the Treaty Against Anti-Personnel Landmines. And for the first time, we were able to use the internet to build a global movement. And it was simply sending emails to colleague organizations around the world, but it allowed us to coordinate a global effort to make sure that different NGOs were pushing their government to join this campaign. And that was revolutionary. The Nobel Peace Prize was awarded to this campaign because it had been such a revolutionary undertaking and because it succeeded with this treaty. So, things began speeding up. But, the big game changer today has been social media. And there, of course, what is empowering about social media is that you don't need to be a formal human rights activist to contribute to human rights reporting or human rights advocacy. Everybody can do it. And you can simply, post on Facebook, put something out on Twitter, and if it's important, it will spread. And this, obviously the people talk about the Tahrir Square uprising in Egypt as having been very much led on Facebook. In Syria today, the war is being fought not simply by people shooting weapons at each other, but by people posting videos of atrocities on YouTube. And this, public diplomacy war is in many ways as important as the shooting war because both sides are trying to claim the moral high ground with the international community to argue that they are the ones that are more respectful of rights. It's the other side that is, a terrorist or what have you. In China, social media has been a huge game changer in the sense that, China has invested enormous resources in building the Great Firewall, which is designed to keep the Chinese people from learning about all that subversive information that lies on the internet outside of China. And the Great Firewall is irrelevant to social media because Sina Weibo and similar social media with 400 million users in China is all about Chinese people talking to Chinese people within the firewall. And the government is scrambling to catch up as they're deploying censor after censor, but it's very hard to censor 400 million people. And they're trying different, tools to block this or that word, but the Chinese people are very inventive and can figure out ways to work around that censorship. And so you see the government having to be responsive to public outrage over various misconduct that otherwise, in an era of just a few years ago, it would have been inclined to ignore. Now, you do sometimes see governments pushing back by trying to shut down the internet. That's something that, for example, Egypt briefly did in January 2011 at the height of the Tahrir Square movement. It's something Libya tried during its revolution a month later in February 2011. Burma tried it in 2007 with the monks' uprising. Kazakhstan tried it recently with an oil strike that took place in December 2011. It doesn't work because what governments find is that they depend on the internet too. And that, for the police or various security forces to communicate, they need to email each other. They need to use the same tools that the activists are using. And so all of these efforts are short-lived, and very quickly the internet is back up. The result of the empowering effect of social media is that it's actually very hard to conceive today of the kind of hidden atrocities that just several decades ago were able to take place. The Holocaust and the murder of so many Jews in concentration camps was to a large degree the product of secrecy. Hitler went out of his way to keep that from the public view. And even though, yes, the people who lived near the train tracks could maybe figure out what was going on, they had no means to communicate that with the outside world. Today they'd go on Twitter. Think about the Khmer Rouge and how, they were able to commit, massive crimes against humanity by just shutting down the country. That wouldn't be possible today. So this has greatly emboldened and empowered the human rights movement in ways that I do think it makes it much more difficult for these large-scale atrocities to be committed. Obviously, you still need governments to be able to react. In Syria, we know what's going on. We know that Assad is fighting this war by deliberately killing civilians, but what's happening to stop that? That's a separate issue, but at least we know. And that makes it possible for us to generate pressure, and it makes it harder for the governments to commit the worst atrocities. Now, I don't want to pretend that social media is a panacea, because I think you all know the kind of the internet term gigo, garbage in, garbage out. You can't believe everything that's put on social media. And one role that remains for established human rights groups is to verify what is put on social media. So, the Human Rights Watch team working on Syria watches all the YouTube videos, but we don't republish them until we're able to figure out that this is exactly what happened, which requires talking to people and matching up different videos and using satellite imagery and using the various investigative techniques that we inevitably use. And only then will we speak out. We would never just republish something that happened to show up on social media. So that's some of the ways that communications technology have made possible what today we know as the modern international human rights movement. And the speed that modern communications technology makes possible is part of how we are able to get things done. That has made us much more able to generate pressure on governments than the slower form of communications made possible in the past. So that's a big difference. A second difference I'd like to address is sort of the basic question, what are human rights? Because while the formal answer to that is, those are the rights that are contained in various international treaties, the practical answer to that has varied over time. Because frankly, the movement started off much more narrowly. If you look at Amnesty in the early days, it started off addressing just so-called prisoners of conscience, people who were being persecuted for their political views who were not engaged in violence. Over time, they took the big, expansive step of adding people who were subject to torture or execution. But that was pretty much it for years, for decades. Today, the movement is much broader. Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, really everybody takes on much, much more. But that didn't happen automatically or overnight. When Human Rights Watch first decided to launch a women's rights program, one of our biggest funders, the Ford Foundation, protested vehemently, telling us that we were diluting the stigma of a human rights violation. And they actually cut our grant because we insisted to go forward anyhow. And that just sort of shows the old style mentality that human rights were understood very narrowly. And so today, as the human rights movement has deliberately taken on a range of victims outside of the classical political prisoner. And so, Human Rights Watch has programs on women's rights and children's rights and gay and lesbian rights and refugee rights and workers' rights and, disability rights and on and on. That now is kind of accepted, but it didn't happen automatically, and often each step of the way had to be fought. The international human rights include not only civil and political rights, which many people are familiar with just from the U.S. Constitution, but also what are known as economic, social, and cultural rights. These are co-equal parts of the International Bill of Rights, but economic and social rights were neglected at the outset. And one of the big problems the human rights movement faced was, how do you use our methodology of investigation and exposing and shaming? How do you use that on economic and social rights issues when you can't, blame the global economy for poverty? There's no one to shame there. Or you can't very well just say, spend more money to alleviate poverty when there may not be more money. And so one of the methodological challenges we faced is to try to focus on governmental decisions where there are resources, but the resources are not conscientiously being deployed in a way of maximizing the welfare of the worst off segments of society. And so that also is an area where there's been very significant evolution. And if you look at the work of Human Rights Watch today, there's very substantial work on the right to health, the right to education. But it took a while for us to find our a firm foundation in these areas so that our methodology would make a meaningful contribution rather than just a rhetorical one. One of the, if you look at international human rights law in the formal sense, it speaks only to governments and it basically contemplates moments of peace. And so one of the challenges of the human rights movement was, how do you deal with war? Now, the answer to that is what's known as international human rights law, international humanitarian law, or the laws of war, the Geneva Conventions and so forth. But this also was a very contested evolution. When Human Rights Watch did its first reporting using humanitarian law, again, we were fought by people who felt that this would put needless pressure on local groups to report on rebel abuses, and people feared that it would put them in jeopardy because they could only envision that it was possible to do human rights work in a war context through solidarity with the rebels. They didn't recognize that you could go in as a neutral arbiter and achieve a degree of security by reporting neutrally on both sides. Today, this is accepted, and today, human rights groups routinely report on both governmental and rebel abuses. And the great advantage of applying humanitarian law is that it answers the question, when is it okay to kill and when not? If you just look at human rights law, it says right to life. That doesn't really answer the question, when is it okay for a soldier to shoot at a combatant? Why is that okay? But it's not okay for a soldier to shoot at a civilian. Humanitarian law makes those distinctions. It's a very detailed body of law explaining what steps are and are not permissible in a war context, but it took a while to get there. Now, one of the roles that human rights groups now play, which was really inconceivable 2.5 decades ago, is that we have begun to shape the world's understanding of humanitarian law. It used to be that the only people who knew anything about humanitarian law were military lawyers working for the Pentagon or its equivalent defense ministries around the world. And needless to say, they interpreted the law in a way that was very deferential to their clients, letting their clients do as much as possible. Now, one of the things that, as the human rights movement got involved in interpreting human rights law, we started pushing back. And so, to take the landmines example, there's a body of law under the laws of war that says you cannot shoot indiscriminately. Now, a landmine is an inherently indiscriminate weapon. It doesn't know who's stepping on it. But nonetheless, every military in the world used landmines. They somehow were able to square this prohibition on indiscriminate warfare with the practice of using landmines, and they just lived with this dissonance. When the human rights movement came in and said, actually, guys, these landmines are indiscriminate, you shouldn't be using them, there was sort of a real effort to fight back, but ultimately they had to recognize that, of course these were indiscriminate weapons, and they were banned. We did something similar with cluster bombs, which are today, the kind of the one dumb, indiscriminate weapon that some militaries still like to use, but has also been banned and is very much on the way out. Today, there's an effort to enforce a different provision of humanitarian law that says that militaries have to do everything feasible to spare civilians the hazards of war. That provision coexists with the practice around the world when militaries are operating in rural areas. Where do they like to build their barracks? Well, in the biggest, most solid structure around, the local school. How do you square that with the duty to protect civilians and protect children from the hazards of war? You can't. And so one thing we're doing now is by talking to militaries in various war contexts and saying, guys, this broad duty to spare civilians means you shouldn't be using the school as your military base. And they almost uniformly agree, but it's like they never thought about it until we brought it up. And so these are the kinds of enforcement steps that we take. Today we're spending a lot of time trying to convince the US government that its use of drones outside of Afghanistan should be governed not by war rules, but by human rights rules, which are much more restrictive in terms of when it's possible to use lethal force. Another area where, if you look superficially at human rights law, it has nothing to say, is the area of business. Multinational corporations are private entities, and human rights law, in a formal sense, speaks to governments. So I remember, 15 years ago, when I would bring up the idea of businesses having human rights responsibilities, CEOs would look at me and say, "What are you talking about? We're here to make a profit for our shareholders. Go home. You human rights groups, you worry about human rights. We're a business." Today, no CEO would say that. They would lose their job in 2 seconds because they've all come to recognize that their reputation depends on avoiding complicity in human rights violations, whether those are labor rights abuses or abuse of security forces or internet companies that become complicit in censorship efforts needlessly. And there have been a series of standards that the human rights movement has helped to develop, which define what complicity means, and in essence have set human rights standards for businesses, despite the fact that formally human rights law doesn't apply to them. And every brand name company now feels a duty to adopt standards, at least formally. Living up to them is a different matter, and that's where we spend a lot of our time. Not fighting the battle as to whether there should be standards, but rather fighting the battle as to whether those standards are being abided by adequately. A big thing that has changed over the years, as I think back, is the research tools that the human rights movement uses. Our traditional tool, and it still is, frankly, a key part of what we do, was to talk to the victims, talk to the witnesses, talk to the government. It was testimonial. And your classic human rights researcher is still out there in the field with pen and paper. There is no substitute for that kind of work. But we have, first of all, speeded up that effort. I mentioned at the outset that we used to send a delegation and 6 months later have a report. Today, we aspire to save lives in real time. And so because of the internet, we are able to do an investigation in the morning and have a mini report out that afternoon with the aim of changing the government's conduct by the next day. And when you're dealing with a situation of real crisis where people are being killed, that speed matters. And we've seen it in Tahrir Square. Human Rights Watch had researchers in Tahrir Square who were conveying our information to our headquarters. We were deploying it in Washington, and Vice President Biden was calling Vice President Suleiman in Egypt, telling him to stop this or that abusive response by the Egyptian security forces. Or today in the Central African Republic, Human Rights Watch has teams deployed there describing the enormous threat of large-scale communal violence. And that information has been conveyed, most importantly, to Paris, where President Hollande has deployed French troops to protect people, and to the UN Security Council in New York, where there's been a commitment to spend the money needed to reinforce the African Union troops there to try to protect lives. We're putting this stuff out on a real-time basis because that's what's required to save lives. So that the electronicized version of the old notepad makes an enormous difference. But we're also using kind of newer gadgetry, if you will. We recently had a debate with the Nigerian government. They are fighting this awful organization, Boko Haram, that is, running around killing people involved in the education of children. And but the Nigerian government is responding brutally. And in one town they went in, and we had evidence that they destroyed 2,000 dwellings in this sort of scorched earth response to a Boko Haram attack. The government said, no, there were just 20 houses that were destroyed, and it was all in crossfire. So we used satellite imagery, and were able to show that actually it was more like 2,400 houses that had been destroyed. And that ability to come in and actually effectively snap a picture of the evidence, even in a place where the government wasn't going to let us in, is one of these real game-changing tools that we now have, which we've deployed in many, many war contexts to demonstrate the severity of the government's response. We're using big data analysis to look at how governments treat large numbers of people to show injustices that arise there. We are using arms experts to help identify, for example, who launched the sarin attack on Ghouta. We were able to demonstrate using video from the scene of the attack, matching that up with other pictures and video we had of the use of various missiles by government and rebel forces. We were able to determine that it could only have been the government that launched the attack. Indeed, we were able to even map a trajectory using data from the ground to pinpoint pretty much where that attack was launched from. So these are kind of different tools that are now part and parcel of the human rights movement. You need this kind of sophistication if you're really going to fight with governments about what happened. It's not just the research, though. It's also the advocacy that has changed. When Human Rights Watch was formed, we went to Washington to lobby. We asked the U.S. government to use its clout on behalf of the human rights movement. Over the last 15 years, we've added capacity to do the same thing in the most important European capitals. And so Human Rights Watch has offices in Paris, Brussels, Berlin, London, Geneva, where we deploy the information that our researchers collect and try to enlist the major European powers on our behalf. But today we have, as power shifts, and as non-Western countries are often the most important player in different regions of the world, we have had to develop the capacity to do advocacy in non-Western capitals as well. And so, for example, it was our Tokyo office that convinced Prime Minister Shinzo Abe to launch a major effort to adopt a commission of inquiry to investigate North Korean crimes against humanity, something that never would have happened if the Human Rights Watch director there had not pigeonholed Abe and convinced him that what he really cared about, which was the Japanese abductees in North Korean custody, that their fate would never improve if he didn't address the broader fate of the North Korean people. Or, for example, an effort to condemn Sri Lanka before the Human Rights Council. A critical vote there was India's, which traditionally doesn't like to support human rights issues. But in this case, the Delhi office of Human Rights Watch was able to make enough noise that the Tamil Nadu party in India threatened to withdraw from the governing coalition unless India supported the resolution condemning the atrocities in Sri Lanka. And it ended up passing through the council. Our work in Johannesburg helped to put South Africa at the forefront of an LGBT rights effort at the UN, which was very important for showing that LGBT rights are not just a Western imposition, but there's actually strong African support for them as well. Today, Brazil is leading the effort to address the NSA mass surveillance of because there's a very partly because Dilma Rousseff was monitored, but partly because there's just broad Brazilian outrage at this going on. So this global advocacy capacity is an increasingly important part of the movement as well. There's been huge change in the area of transitional justice. It used to be in the 1980s that the most you could aspire to was the truth. Justice was the rare exception, in the case of the total defeat of the enemy, as in Nuremberg. That began to change a little bit with Nelson Mandela and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, where the threat of prosecution was used to force people to tell the truth. With the Yugoslav and the Bosnian and the Rwandan genocides, guilt at not having stopped those led to the creation of international tribunals that for the first time made international justice possible. So even if the dictator could stop domestic prosecution, he couldn't reach the prosecutor in The Hague. And today the International Criminal Court epitomizes that international commitment to justice even when national courts are compromised. The communications front, if you think about it, there's been a massive revolution. Rather than the old press release, faxed out to journalists, rather than email individually targeting journalists, today you can put information out on Twitter. There are nearly 1 million people following Human Rights Watch on Twitter, another 650,000 on Facebook. It has become so easy to get word out. And indeed, to a large degree, while the formal media is very important, social media has become itself a vehicle for educating the public and policymakers about what's going on. And finally, the last thing that I'll point out that has really changed has been the elements of the movement itself, the NGOs, the human rights groups that comprise the movement. Because today, in virtually every country around the world, there are local human rights activists who are recording their government's atrocities, publicizing what's going on, and generating pressure for change. And these are the people that the international groups like Amnesty or Human Rights Watch work intimately with. They help to establish the agenda, they help to conduct the fact-finding, they help to do the advocacy, and we try to magnify their concerns, we try to provide protection when it's too dangerous for them to operate. But this global movement is an enormous strength and greatly magnifies the work of the handful of international groups. So, what we've had is, over the time that I've been involved in the movement, a huge evolution in the way that it operates and in its strength. It's not a matter of just standing for the right thing. We have the capacity to generate real pressure for things to change. We've shown that facts, that information, when carefully collected and properly deployed, can be enormously powerful and have the capacity to change the conduct of governments, even in very distant corners of the world. So we may not have the power of any individual government. We obviously operate with far fewer resources. But what we've been able to show through the movement is that it doesn't take that many people if you have the truth on your side and if you stand for values that are widely shared. Because no government wants to be held up to the disapproval of its people. And if we can succeed in showing that it is operating in a way that contradicts the values of its people, we are on the path to forcing it to change. So let me stop there, and I would welcome your questions and comments on this or anything else of contemporary relevance. Thank you.
So Ken, thank you, first of all, for some great prepared remarks. There are quite a few questions here across a broad array of topics. What I would say is there's a first kind of category around U.S. policy,
yes,
and then there's a variety of questions about specific developments in certain geographies, and then there's a set of questions on the organization itself and its priorities. Let me start on the U.S. side. First question is, why should Americans be allowed to kill using drones or CIA agents anywhere under the U.S. Constitution or international law? You touched on it briefly, but if you could say a little bit more.
Yeah. Well, okay. I mean, first of all, let me just, with respect to drones, in a war context, drones have certain advantages over other weapons if your aim is to minimize civilian casualties, in the sense is that they are extraordinarily accurate. I mean, not only do they hit what they're targeted at, but they have the capacity to linger and choose the most propitious moment to attack. Ideally a moment when there are no civilians present, when they're certain that the target they're aiming at is the target they want to be aiming at. Now, like every weapon system, though, they are, first of all, dependent on the accuracy of the intelligence that they collect. So if you tell the drone operator that that's an al-Qaeda operative down there, and it turns out to be a collection of tribal elders, you're going to hit a bunch of civilians. And so, drones are not immune to that problem, but that's a problem of every weapon system. The real problem with drones and the debate we've been having with the Obama administration is what rules should be governing the use of drones. Should they be war rules or should they be policing or law enforcement rules? In Afghanistan, where there's a war going on, war rules apply. And under war rules, you're allowed to shoot the other side's combatants. That's, it's not nice, but that's what war is about. You're supposed to spare civilians, but once you see a combatant, you don't have to offer him the opportunity to surrender. You don't have to, show that he poses a lethal threat. You don't have to do anything. If they're a combatant, you can shoot them. And that's true for drones as for any other weapon system. The problem in places like Yemen or Somalia is that it's not clear that it's appropriate to be using war rules there. The U.S. is not at war with any body in Yemen. The argument being made by the defenders of war rules is that there's a global war against terrorism. But that was the Bush term. Obama doesn't use the term, but it's still applying, in many ways, the same concept. And the problem there is that if it really is a global war, what are the limits to that? Why can't they be using lethal force against a terrorist suspect on the streets of Paris or London? And they don't really have a good answer to that. We've been pushing them to apply policing rules, to recognize that, yes, al-Qaeda poses a threat, but it's not a radically different threat from, Mexican drug cartels or, other dangerous criminal enterprises that are out there. and that under policing rules, you can still use drones sometimes. You can still use lethal force, but only as a last resort to meet an imminent threat to life, an imminent lethal threat. And Obama, in a speech he gave in May at the National Defense University, virtually embraced those standards. He gave a speech where he said all the right things and basically used the same policing standards that we'd been recommending, except that he gave the speech more as a law professor than as the commander-in-chief. He kind of talked as if these would be good standards to apply. We got to have the war. War is not going to go on forever. It's doing us real harm. We have to end the war. It's near the time when we should end the war. But he didn't say, and these are the rules that we're going to use. So that's kind of the battle we have right now. Human Rights Watch just did a report on 6 incidents in Yemen, where we showed that these standards that Obama articulated are not being followed. And so we're kind of fighting the factual battle now, where we seem to have kind of, at least at a theoretical level, agreement around the principles, not yet a clear declaration from Obama that these should apply, more like a theoretical declaration. But we're kind of working in the right direction. So the aim is not to abolish the use of drones, but rather to regulate them by the proper rules, which is policing rules, not war rules, outside of a classic war battleground like Afghanistan.
Good. There's also a variety of questions about the internet, the impact of the internet. Questions about the Snowden case that recently came out. Questions about the SOPA bill that came out a year or so ago. The impact of the internet and protection of rights there. What's your views on that?
Well, I think personally Snowden did a service by exposing what is a complete imbalance between legitimate concerns with national security and a complete disregard for our privacy rights. Now, part of that imbalance is a problem of the law. Under U.S. law, as it has been interpreted, we have no privacy right at all in our so-called metadata. That is, the people we call, the people we email, the places we go as tracked on our cell phones. All of this metadata is the government's for the taking, according to current law. There's a real need to revisit that law, but that's the current state of the law. There are restrictions on the government's ability to listen to our telephone conversations or to read our email, but you can piece together virtually your entire life just by figuring out who you're visiting, who you're talking to, who you're emailing. So that's an area where there is a real need for, I think, a better assessment of what the balance should be. Similarly, U.S. law gives no recognition whatsoever to the privacy rights of non-Americans outside the United States, allowing the U.S. even to listen in to their conversations and to read their emails. That's something that drives the rest of the world crazy, rightfully, and is leading to real pressure by U.S. internet companies to re-examine because they're fearful that they're going to lose business as governments say, well, if we can't trust the United States to respect the privacy of our German citizens or our Brazilian citizens, we're just going to force all this internet data to stay in Germany or Brazil. And so there is real pressure there. Another aspect of U.S. law, kind of as interpreted by the NSA, this is without the Supreme Court's blessing, is that the NSA has adopted the crazy view that when it collects our information, our communications, our metadata, that doesn't impinge our privacy rights. Our privacy concerns are only impinged when it looks at that data. So, the analogy I always use is, imagine the NSA puts a video camera in your bedroom. And they say, you have nothing to worry about. Your privacy rights are not implicated until we look at the video. You'd be comfortable with that rule, right? But that's current law. So there's a real need to strike a better balance. And again, the answer is not no surveillance. Targeted surveillance is perfectly appropriate. If you have evidence to suggest that criminal activity is being plotted or undertaken via a particular email account over a particular telephone line, show that evidence to some neutral arbiter, ideally a judge, get a warrant, and listen in. Read the email, by all means. But this mass collection of our communications is not, the government has not been able to justify it in terms of demonstrating that it has had an impact in stopping terrorist plots, and it is a mass infringement of what we legitimately view as our privacy.
Good. Another question on U.S. policy has to do with what actions the U.S. should take to promote self-determination in occupied territories in Palestine and the Western Sahara.
Okay. Well, the question of self-determination is actually not an issue that the human rights movement gets involved with, mainly because there's no principled way to define what the self is. So we don't take a position as to whether Western Sahara should be part of Morocco or its own territory. We don't take a position as to, what the precise territorial dimensions of an ultimate Palestinian state should be. Where we do get involved is with respect to human rights or humanitarian law violations in that context. And so just to take the example of the West Bank, we're very involved in the clear illegality of the settlements. The Geneva Conventions, but the Fourth Geneva Convention prohibits an occupying power from transferring its population into occupied territory. That's what the settlements are. And so we're very involved with that. The U.S., unfortunately, has been largely ignoring that issue. They've been so eager to sort of get people together to negotiate that they've been neglecting the underlying human rights violations, I think to the detriment of the prospects of the negotiations. But it's been, there's been this effort to sort of segregate the two out and to focus on the peace process. I don't think you can successfully pursue peace if there are ongoing serious abuses, which in this case the Palestinians legitimately see as gradually destroying their prospects for a future state.
Mm-hmm. Good. Let me add on to the topic. A couple of questioners say there's been a lot of focus and discussion about governments creating a bad environment for the majority population. But if you look at protections for the minority population, there's several questions on India specifically, the Sikh population there, the number of people imprisoned, protests that occur, and then yet people are put back into prison, et cetera. The whole situation in India.
Yeah. Well, the problem with the Sikhs had been, much more severe, really probably 20, 25 years ago when there was a very significant separatist movement in the Punjab. Today, the big kind of remaining conflicts, the Kashmir conflict is dying down, but is still ongoing. There's a so-called Naxalite conflict, which takes place sort of through the central spine of India, which sets the Indian government against Maoist rebels. And then there are a series of small-scale rebellions in some of the tribal areas of the northeastern states. And one of the common denominators to Indian abuse in those conflicts is something known as the Armed Forces Special Protection or Special Procedures Act, which essentially gives the Indian military impunity for their use of lethal force in a designated conflict area like Kashmir. And whenever there's no judicial oversight, whenever people know that they can use lethal force and there will be no consequence, that's when you're inviting abuse. And so one of the big priorities for Human Rights Watch is to get this act repealed and to make clear that just because there's a war doesn't mean that soldiers should be given license to do whatever they want. There are rules that should apply in a war context, and it's the government's duty to hold soldiers to those rules.
Good. Say more about China and Russia. And the question, here is what type of expansion of human rights can occur in that area, and what role can Human Rights Watch have there?
Well, both Russia and China are very dynamic situations today. In the case of Russia, even though Putin has been cracking down recently, I think it's fair to say he's running scared. Beginning with the demonstrations over the Duma elections of 2 years ago, where his party won, but there was, big protests over the fairness of the elections. There were then protests over Putin's decision to retake the presidency. And he feels that in many ways he has lost the liberal community in the big cities of Moscow and St. Petersburg and some other places. So he increasingly is kind of pandering to a very conservative base. If you ask, why would he do something so crazy as to prosecute the Pussy Riot women or the Greenpeace activists, why is he running around labeling NGOs as foreign agents? Why is he cracking down on demonstrations? A lot of this is an effort to appeal to the more conservative political base in the Russian hinterland. I think it's a short-sighted strategy. I think it's one that he's gradually losing. but it explains a lot of what's going on right now. And there is, frankly, a real battle with people who are looking for greater freedoms than Putin seems willing to grant them today. There's something in many ways similar going on in China. Xi Jinping has now taken over. His initial foray had a couple of interesting reforms in that he eased slightly the one-child policy without abolishing it. He abolished something called re-education through labor, which is one method of administratively detaining people, that is, detaining people without charge or trial, but hasn't abolished administrative detention altogether. So these are, kind of baby step forward, good steps, but not radical steps. In the meantime, the government is doing everything it can to crack down on the social media that I mentioned, to go after anybody who talks about, political reform at a national level. Liu Xiaobo, the Nobel Prize winner, is still serving his 11-year sentence. There's something called the New Citizens Movement that is very much continuing in his footsteps, which is being actively persecuted. So there is a real crackdown over organized efforts to promote political reform. And God forbid you mention the fact that all the government officials in China are incredibly rich. Where did that money come from? That's like the one topic that, is guaranteed to get you into trouble. So these, again, there is a push by the citizenry for greater freedoms, and the government is clinging to power through, repressive means that are not working terribly well, but there is a battle going on.
Good. And the next questioner asks more about the breadth of your work and priorities. And the specific question is, where does Human Rights Watch stand on economic human rights? Should every individual have a minimum income? Is that a privilege or a right? How does your focus lay out on that?
Well, if you look at the relevant treaty here, which is called the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, it doesn't speak about a minimum income. What it talks about are various economic rights, whether it's a right to a job or right to adequate housing or right to an education or right to health care. And the duty it imposes on the government is not a minimum standard, but rather to use available resources to gradually improve respect for these rights. So, I think a way to put this in kind of simple language is there's a duty on governments to use the resources they have to conscientiously apply those to maximize the economic and social rights of their people. So it doesn't say that the way to do this is through a minimum wage, or the way to do this is by investing in schools versus roads, or hospitals versus other things. There's a lot of discretion left to governments, but the real requirement is that they apply available resources conscientiously. And so it's clearest when those duties are being violated, when governments, say, are spending money on prestige items, or wasting money on corruption, or discriminating against elements of the population. That's when there are the clearest examples of violations of economic and social rights. So it's not it doesn't get so refined as to say there should be a minimum wage or there should be this or that minimum standard. It's rather, this government should be using what they have to gradually make things better.
Mm-hmm. Good. And the next set of questions has to do with the priorities of the organization. Mm-hmm. You've obviously raised a lot of different issues. You're working simultaneously. So first question is, does Human Rights Watch intentionally prioritize the condemnation of abuses in certain countries over others? And somewhat related question is, would you agree that the human rights movement would be more successful, higher impact, if it were to maintain more practical goals rather than more far-off ideals?
Okay. Well, certain assumption there, but okay. First of all, where we work, Human Rights Watch works in about 90 countries on a regular basis. We try to work every place where there are serious abuses. So we're obviously not in every country in the world. We don't spend a lot of time in Denmark, but it's, but we are pretty much every place where there's an abusive war or an authoritarian government, and that is a stretch. Ideally we have one researcher per country, but we don't always get there. We for the moment don't have a researcher for Central African Republic. We're cannibalizing researchers from elsewhere. But that's what we aim to. So we don't, we really do try to cover everything that's serious. We also, even say in the United States, we focus on areas where the courts are not doing an adequate job. If you can sue the government to enforce your rights, we kind of leave it to the ACLU. Human Rights Watch gets involved where litigation is not going to be the optimal strategy or where it's not an adequate strategy, and where we can apply our investigation and reporting methodology to generate political pressure to respect rights. So Human Rights Watch has been doing a lot of work on immigration issues since, an undocumented migrant almost by definition can't go to court without getting deported. We do a lot of work on criminal justice questions, particularly over-incarceration, the over-reliance on these excessive prison sentences, which are, legal in a sense, so you can't go to court and challenge them, but you do need to step back and generate a policy debate about whether this is the right way to go about, nonviolent drug offenders, for example. And we do a lot of work around counterterrorism questions because, again, the courts, while they theoretically have jurisdiction, they tend not to take it. They tend to duck the issues, whether it's Guantanamo or drones, or we'll see what happens with NSA surveillance. So those are the kinds of things that we take on, even in a country that has a strong legal system, but where our methodology has a significant contribution. In terms of, what are the goals, we are super practical. I mean, we are willing to take on issues that will require work for a long time. I mean, the fact that we can't get a quickie solution doesn't mean we'll ignore it, because some things are important and worth pursuing. And so, I mean, for example, here in California, we worked for 6 years to get a law that would stop the use of life imprisonment without parole for child offenders. This wasn't an overnight thing, but it was a very practical thing, and it was something that we thought we had a reasonable chance of success, but it took a long-term commitment to make it happen. But our goals are practical. We don't run around saying, freedom and love, and I mean, we are very, very focused on concrete actions that we want governments to take.
Mm-hmm. The most popular set of questions has to do with how people can engage in this broader effort. So there are questions, we have a lot of young professionals here and students here. There are questions that are asking, how can people best make a difference and engage? One from a high school student, one from a college student, another one a young attorney, another one a member of the World Affairs Council. How can the World Affairs Council engage? Another individual retired. How can people best engage?
Yeah. Okay, well, I mean, first of all, I should say Human Rights Watch has a very active chapter here in the Bay Area. And so people who want to get involved at an active level, we have an office here in San Francisco, get involved that way. But at a more generic level, the strength of the human rights movement comes from our ability to generate disapproval with governmental conduct. If we expose something and everybody applauds, we're not going to change it. We're going to reinforce it. So in order for us to say, push the U.S. government to change its attitude toward, Bahrain, a very authoritarian country that the U.S. is actively supporting because there's a military base there and because the Saudis don't want democratic change there, the only way that's going to happen is if the U.S. government hears from Americans that they're not happy with this. And so, kind of the generic answer to how do you make a difference is, you inform yourself through, whether it's the Human Rights Watch website or the newspaper or subscribing to our Twitter feed or whatever, you inform yourself, and then you find ways to spread the word and to generate outrage. And that can be, it can be as simple as emailing or writing to your governmental representatives. It can be, making phone calls. It can be holding seminars. It can just be, retweeting something or sharing it on Facebook. But that building awareness and building outrage is how ultimately you change governments. And governments, every government, even dictatorial governments, but certainly the U.S. government, is sensitive to public opinion. If they are hearing from people that they are not happy with U.S. attitude towards U.S. policy toward Bahrain, that's when that policy is going to begin to change.
Another related question is about careers in human rights. One of the students asked, how can you define a career? And you and I were talking ahead of time, and I was just fascinated to hear about your career as a federal prosecutor and how that was actually helpful in what you do today. But talk more about careers.
All right. Well, I mean, first, the researchers that Human Rights Watch hires, we are not looking for a particular degree. The researchers, some of them are lawyers, some are journalists, some are academics. The degree doesn't really matter. We're looking for skill sets. We're looking for people who speak the languages. We have, I think, 77 languages on staff. We're looking for people who are comfortable operating in the countries where we work, who have experience living overseas. We want people who have the good judgment to, first of all, stay safe themselves, but second, to conduct a difficult investigation and get at the truth, even in politically charged situations where everybody's lying to you. And then once you've done those investigations, we need people who can write well, because you've got to write up your findings, who can speak well to the press, who can advocate with government. So it's a complicated set of skills. Ideally, we put them all together in one person. If we can't, we'll divide tasks a little bit. But I would focus, if you're interested in a career, I would focus on those skills. Get languages, live overseas, do investigative work as best you can. If you can't do that, do at least, development work or humanitarian work, something that gets you into these situations. And that's where you begin to develop the skills that we're looking for. My personal background was somewhat idiosyncratic. I knew from an early age that I wanted to do human rights work. It was a somewhat naive thing to want to do. I signed up for the one human rights course that was on offer at my law school, and each of the 3 years it was canceled. So, so I graduated with no human rights training at all. I then went into a world where there were no jobs. Human Rights Watch had 2 employees. So I started volunteering. I was, working as a lawyer and ultimately as a prosecutor, and I spent many a night and weekend volunteering. And I did that for 6 years. And it was at the end of those 6 years where a job opened up at Human Rights Watch, and because I had been a volunteer out there and they vaguely knew of me, I got a phone call. Would I be interested in applying for this job? And I did, and the rest is history, But it's, the lesson that I draw from that, since obviously it's a bit of a, kind of unusual background, is that, if you really want to do this work, start doing it. Just find a way to get involved. And it may not be for pay at first. You may have to have a job on the side, but just start doing it, because the people who do get involved are the ones who tend to stay involved, and ultimately things tend to work out for people.
Good. A couple last questions. The first one here is, in the spirit of the holidays, what tools or resources do you wish for to help make the organization even more effective?
Okay. Yeah, money, right?
A lot of money?
Yes. Well, no, I mean, look, it's, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention, our Human Rights Watch operates today on $70 million annually, a staff of 400 people around the world. We are actively trying to build the organization. And we are trying to add researchers to countries that are not covered. We're trying to build advocacy offices in key capitals where we don't have them. We're trying to build our capacity to project our information in the press by putting press officers in key press centers like Nairobi or Bangkok, where we don't have people at the moment. So we've made great progress in building a global organization with the ability to reach wherever it matters, but we're not there yet. And so we need those resources. We also are looking for those tools. And today we are trying to, build our capacity to make our website really the go-to place. So we're investing a lot in creating our own videos and photographs. We're, send videographers and photographers on a lot of our research missions. We're investing a lot, obviously, in social media. We're investing in things like satellite imagery. So we're experimenting with, a lot of the tools to make what we do better and more effective. And a lot of that is, when push comes to shove, a question of resources. Mm-hmm.
Makes sense. Last question for you. You've done a great job talking about the history and the current environment for human rights. Fast forward for us 5-10 years. What are we going to see in the future? How concerned are you about a worsening situation, or how optimistic are you that actually there'll be notable progress in the next few years?
Well, I mean, first of all, I'll begin by answering a bit retrospectively. If I think back, how has the world changed in the last 20 years? It's changed enormously. And there are parts of the world today that are much better than they were 20 years ago. 20 years ago, there were basically military dictatorships throughout much of Latin America. Today, they're, mostly, but not exclusively, democracies. Eastern Europe was under communism. Today, it's mostly democratic. Southern Africa was under apartheid. Today, there's a thriving democracy there. A lot of East Asia looks much better today than it was 2 decades ago. So there has been great progress, but it's never linear. And there are parts of the world, the Middle East is in great turmoil. A lot of Central Africa is very deadly. A lot of Central Asia is quite repressive. So I kind of look at this as a perpetual battle. I think governments are always tempted to violate human rights. It's always a convenient way of tamping down the opposition or getting things done. And the job of the human rights movement is to raise the cost of that temptation, to push back, so that when governments engage in what is often, a fairly rational cost-benefit analysis as to whether it's worth it or not to respect rights, we try to tip the balance in favor of respect. Now, looking forward, what do I worry about? I worry about, for example, the Chinese model of economic development. If countries see that, you can develop while being authoritarian, that's a very tempting model to many a dictator around the world. I worry about the communal violence that you see rising in many parts of the world. Particularly the sectarianism in the Middle East, the continuing Christian Muslim violence that we see in the Central African Republic. I worry about the increasing attacks on international justice. There are many African leaders today that are attacking the International Criminal Court because of its exclusive focus so far in Africa. So there are real threats out there. I tend to be an optimist. I think the human rights movement is gaining strength with time, but I'm not so naive as to think that this progress is going to be linear or easy. And I think that we have a duty to engage in a battle. What heartens me, I guess, is recognizing that the movement is stronger today, that we're developing more effective, stronger tools to fight back, but it's going to be a fight.
Well said. Let me say now in closing, thank you for a fascinating program this evening. Your insights were great. The questions that the audience asked were terrific. Let me say, please, all of you join me in thanking Kenneth Roth for a great session.
Thank you.